This is Marketing Uncomplicated. All right, everybody, welcome back to Uncomplicated Marketing. I have Chris Peterson with me, who is the co-founder of LifeMind, an AI agent platform designed for national, local, and regional markets. And we're going to get into what that actually means, but let's bring on Chris and introduce him, and we'll get diving in. Thank you. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Totally. Thank you. It's really good. And just so everybody knows, Chris is calling in from Milan, so we're reaching global regions. So thank you for that.
You bet.
So, Chris, you founded the Solid Agency, worked for Fortune 500s and now lead an AI-driven platform, which is super exciting. And, obviously we want to dive into a little bit of that because there is this huge noise that's happening around AI. And we want to make sure that people understand, the value that they're getting from this type of platform. But what inspired you to pivot into authorship with red and blue customers?
Yeah, so throughout my marketing career, I was always drawn to customer insights. And I just wanted to understand better why people do what they do,
Yeah.
which of course includes why do they buy certain stuff?
Yeah.
And, if you don't know that in marketing, it's hard to do marketing. And so I always gravitated toward a lot of research. I love reading research. And over the years, I worked with great researchers and account planners. And I always found market insights to me as a business person while I was running agencies to be one of the most interesting aspects of the business. And then along comes a Pew Research study in December 2020, which it was right after the 2020 election, and it allowed liberals and conservatives to tell each other in an open-ended question what they want the other side to know about them. And I thought it was really interesting because it wasn't like a typical research study. And I read through these hundreds of responses. And what struck me was this notion that these were two different visions of the world, two different ways of seeing the world. And I wanted to figure out, well, if that's true, how does this not affect what they buy? Okay. And that's what kicked off my book project. That's what got me going. I'm like, okay. And as soon as I dove into the topic, I got completely hooked because I felt like I was identifying something so fundamental to understanding customers and markets that has not been put on the table because it feels like politics, and it doesn't have to be about politics at all.
Yeah. No, I love that you connect that because I think a marketer is stronger when they understand the analytics. And I think, listen, not every marketer is going to be sort of, a well-rounded understanding or reach the level of CMO to have that strategy and know how to pull the levers, and similar to like what I like to say, be the conductor of the symphony, because sometimes you need people who are just focused on certain tracks, but to understand the strategy perspective of things to really make your chess moves, analytics is super important. Otherwise, where are you going and how are you shifting, and how are you going to win ultimately within the customer space?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And this is fundamentally about strategy.
Yeah.
And the great thing about strategy is it doesn't cost you anything. Unless, I mean,
Yeah.
if you could hire a bunch of consultants, that's absolutely true. But in the end, the fundamental decisions you make about your business, come from within and the influences that you have. And so to shift strategy, it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, and yet it can open up a market in a tremendous way.
Yeah. I love that you I love that you really connected sort of the political, ideology and, from the Pew Research and really, migrating in that moment. Maybe I'm getting a little political here with our current, president, where everybody's like, he shouldn't be running our country like a business.
Hmm.
Let's just dive a little bit into that because I think that there's a lot of psychology, that I'm sure that you reference within the book. And I kind of want to pinpoint on a little bit of that in connection to, how businesses are run and really that through line that you created from the political ideology in connection to consumer behavior.
Yeah, yeah. So you bring up a good point in using the word psychology, because when I dove into the book project, I wanted to first understand are there differences between these two markets? Like, do they buy different things? And honestly, you can spend 10 or 15 minutes online and discover this if you just simply ask the question.
Yeah.
So they buy different products, they consume different media, they align with different brands. The data comes from Harris Interactive. It comes from looking at data around television viewership. Like, one interesting example that I tell people is that the TV shows, How to Get Away with Murder, Modern Family, Doctor Who, Outlander, Game of Thrones, are watched almost exclusively by liberal customers. SEAL Team,
Interesting.
Last Man Standing, New Amsterdam, Chicago Fire, and The Good Doctor are watched almost exclusively by conservative customers.
That's
And
so
yet
strange.
yeah, so it's not just Fox News and CNN or
Yeah.
MSNBC. It goes way beyond that,
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
and if you simply ask the question, you find the differences. So back to your point about psychology, once I realized, oh my gosh, these are really two different markets. There is overlap, obviously, and not everyone is purely liberal or conservative. Most people are moderate, and that's,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that they aren't, but people have effectively sorted themselves generally into one side or the other to varying degrees.
Yes.
And so the next step was to figure out, okay, so how can I tap into insights about these two markets that a business can use and apply?
Mm-hmm.
And so I started looking for research, as I always do. And what I found was there was like this treasure trove of research in social psychology, social anthropology, and cultural geography,
Mm-hmm.
not political science. There was really very little insight that was good for a business from political science. But within social psychology, there's an enormous amount of studies that show the differences between liberals and conservatives that are easily applied in a commercial context. And some of them are in a commercial context, like research in food shopping behavior between liberal and conservative customers, and how, liberal customers will switch food brands really quickly and experiment and try different things, whereas conservative customers won't. And they
Yeah.
want the more tried and true and, reliable types of brands. And just that one insight extends into really interesting strategies, even around how you launch a new product,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what I found was I set out to identify, I thought, well, if I can identify 5 or 7 distinct values that a business could use, then I felt like I had something. And I ended up finding 27,
Wow.
20 that distinguish the two groups and 7 that unite. And it was amazing. It was such a great journey to find all this and document it. And in the book, it's all set up like a menu system and referenced. And it was and to your point, it's the psychology of it, not
Mm.
the politics of it. So the distinction that I make in the book that's really central is that it's about the worldview, not the politics. It's about how the two groups see the world and believe what they believe. And one of the points I make is if you have a certain worldview, you shop for politicians just like you shop for products. You're looking for
Yes.
something that is a fit in your life in that moment, okay? And a fit it can be seen as a cultural fit. It's
Yes.
a fit that happens, with who you are, how you grew up, and more importantly, even the environment around you in a local manner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. I mean, well done for kind of creating that through line, because I think that it is the same psychology, and customers are customers, and their likes and wants and needs are very similar, not just dependent on how they categorize or in essence like put themselves in some kind of box, right?
Hmm.
I want to like pick your brain a little bit about this piece though, because I think it's interesting from a branding perspective. So obviously, like when Elon Musk like launched the Tesla car, more I don't know the data around it, but I'm assuming more liberals who cared about the earth, like so on and so forth, were reaching out to buy the Tesla car. And then all of a sudden, because of his move within the political spectrum, that shift has completely changed, and you are basically a Republican if you own a Tesla.
Or you have to have a bumper sticker that
Yeah.
with a
I still
line
care
through
for the
Elon's
world.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
Well,
wild consumer psychological shift, as we are talking about.
and it is. And now the interesting backstory behind the shift with Tesla is
Yeah.
that you're absolutely right. It started with a more urban liberal audience. If you look at the design of the car, it's more abstract and modern looking, which would
Hmm.
appeal to a more urban audience. It will naturally EVs tend to be consumed more by an urban audience because of the distance that people might drive.
Yeah.
And now the interesting thing about Tesla is this, though, which is, Elon Musk's effect on the business started happening when he acquired Twitter and turned it into X, right?
Yes. Yes.
And even before that, Tesla buyers were starting to skew a little conservative. And the reason for that, it's similar to Apple. When you create a great product that is innovative and breakthrough, you first attract a more urban liberal audience, but then as the conservative audience sees the product is proven and
Hmm.
is a great product that starts to feel more familiar, they start to adopt it. So
Yeah.
that was actually happening right before that, the acquisition of Twitter, which then thrust Elon Musk's political worldview into the limelight. And then now it's even amplified more. But you're right. It's gone almost all the way toward a more conservative audience. And unfortunately, I don't think it's sustainable because if you want to truly scale your sales, you have to have both. It's
Yes.
great to start with the
Yes.
urban liberal audience, but you want to make a transition where you build on it.
Yes.
You don't try to
Yes.
replace it.
Completely agree. I think we're really touching on a valuable point here and a very, very, very important point, which goes back to, the analytics as we talked about earlier and just data analysis and knowing the insights of, your customers' purchasing behaviors and the whys and the wants and the desires and the needs ultimately. But what I do find interesting is that if you think of a company, said company, you think of the role of like the chief revenue officer, you think of the role of the chief financial officer, you think of the role of the chief product officer, or even the people that funnel under those C-suite level or the executive team, and then of course like the team that's maybe running everything. Their goal is kind of like one stop, kind of like we need to reach X, right?
Hmm.
But people tend to not realize that when you think of a marketer and a marketing team and somebody who leads up the marketing, we have goals that are set, but those goals are reliant on changes and shifts within the market, within purchasing, god forbid we ever are to go through another COVID again, world, different types of things that erupt in the world and so on and so forth. So our sort of goals shift so much more than these individual departments, which brings me to a question that I think is super interesting in terms of why don't most businesses consider political worldview in their marketing strategy?
Well, I think there are two reasons because that was a big early question,
Yeah.
right? And like it's like if this is so obvious, then why haven't people done this, right?
Yes.
And when I looked at it, well, the first answer is that these two markets have really snapped into place over just the last 20 years. So I researched polarization in and of itself, and the roots of it go back to actually 1950. You really
Mm-hmm.
don't pick it up before then. And coincidentally, 1950 is the start of television adoption in the household.
Mm-hmm.
And
Hmm.
TVs became adopted between 1950 and 1960. Uh, all of a sudden, 92% of households had a television. Now, all of a
Yeah.
sudden, world events were in your living room and you're experiencing them. But then the year 2000 really was where the hockey stick of polarization came in with digital media
Mm-hmm.
and how and the the breakup of all the different news entities and having them compete and find audiences and then amplifying differences.
Mm-hmm.
So one reason is over the last 20 years, and it really is digital media that's driven this large spike. The two markets have snapped into place. But the other reason, which I think everyone can relate to, is that the topic feels like politics, so it therefore feels risky to talk about in a
Mm-hmm.
business environment.
Yeah.
And yet, it's not about the politics. Like I said, it's about the worldview. And what's so interesting about this is that if you study it in a dispassionate way without judgment, which I know is hard for some people, but if you do that, you actually learn so much more about the other side, um, no matter what side that is,
Yes,
you
yes,
know? And it actually has this effect of bringing temperature down,
yes,
and which was not something I expected, but my readers tell me, they're like, this has actually affected me personally, not just professionally.
yes,
And so, putting this on the table feels risky, but honestly, what's more risky is not putting it on the table because there's no such thing as being neutral in the marketplace. That was
yeah,
another big insight. Every
interesting.
business projects one way or the other, a little or a lot.
Yeah,
And if you don't ask the question, are my customers liberal or conservative, and what are we projecting, and doing that assessment, it's just kind of happenstance, and it
yeah,
might be creating a tailwind or a headwind depending
yeah.
on the situation.
It is very interesting that you bring up the 1950s because there was something else that I read about that era when everybody had a TV in their homes was that, everyone gathered around that TV, no matter who was in office. You still had that sort of family time that brought everybody together to watch, the presidential speech, or,
The
whenever he's
debate, the
the
first debate.
debates, the first debates, and so on and so forth, or even when somebody was elected, whenever they had like announcements and that kind of thing, everyone sat around. Nowadays it's like there isn't that gathering, there isn't that family sort of debate, as in, potentially what conversations could have been happening around the dining table and in the TV room that are no longer happening right now because it's all happening on the phone, and all of these sort of polarized conversations are kind of, dispersed across everywhere. um it's
That's
it's
right.
it's super interesting. And I love that you also talk about how it's almost like the liberals, they kind of test out and are open to like new. And then the conservatives are, once it's tried and true, they kind of move in that direction. Um, are there areas where both groups actually align?
Yes. Well, so in our research,
Yeah.
we identify certain values that distinguish. So let me give you a couple quick examples, and I'll give you some where they align, because it becomes interesting in terms of shaping a brand.
Yes.
So, and also it speaks to launching new innovative products. So liberal customers, this is kind of a different way of saying what you just said. Liberal customers are are not as happy with the present. They think it needs fixing. And so there's a desire to re-engineer the present to create a better future. Conservative customers, the present is more acceptable, so there's less reason to change it, and there's a desire to maintain it. And as a result, the future is more known. Now, that's all sounds very theoretical, but has big
Hmm.
implications for innovative product launches and who you actually go after for something new. And then there are other values like change boundaries, exploration, self-moderation. One of the most interesting ones to me was this notion of self-moderation and self-expression,
Yeah.
where if you show a customer in a TV spot or an ad or online jumping for joy, exuberant, right? I mean, how many times have we seen this, right?
Yeah.
And they're jumping for joy, and they're probably, wearing something super colorful. Well, that is going to be a visual clue that is good for a more liberal audience, because liberal customers are far more into self-expression than conservative customers. And the
Oh
interesting thing
yeah.
that came out of the research was that people can intuitively tell instinctually if someone is conservative or liberal. And so you have what are effectively a fair number of liberal marketers projecting these types of values onto a market kind of unwittingly,
Yeah.
honestly. I mean, I did it for decades. I can relate to it. I mean, I look back on my career and I'm like, God, I wish I'd known this, before.
Earlier. Hmm.
But then to your question, are there values that unite the two groups? And
Yeah.
so what we did was we looked at research. It wasn't research. It was we looked at articles that were written by international schools and international businesses for expats and foreign students to prepare them
Hmm.
for coming to the United States. Okay. And there were about 40 or 50 of them, and we measured the overlap. And the overlap was like 80 to 90%. And the themes that come out of this, I'll tell you what they are.
What is it they have? They have what to prepare them?
Well, so for example,
Yeah. Yes.
Harvard wrote
I
an
see what you're
article,
saying. Okay.
yeah, for
Yeah.
students coming from overseas saying,
Yes.
hey, brace yourself, here's what America's like.
Yeah, yeah.
And very similar, it could be an international bank
Yeah.
doing the same thing.
With
And
recruitment.
yeah, and the common themes were remarkable.
Yeah.
So the things that come out of it are, and what these are effectively American values.
Yes.
Okay. These are things that bring both groups together, and they really have roots in the American dream and
Mm-hmm.
the original like migration to the United States.
Yep.
You can argue whether or not the American dream is, alive and well or not, but these themes are still there. So I'll just rattle them off. Independence and self-determination, competition, productivity, ingenuity, directness, underdog, and friendliness and informality.
Mm-hmm.
So a business or brand could take these values and use a few of them, not all of them, to possibly shape how they express themselves to a market in order to attract both groups.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that the right strategy is to attract both groups all the time, because it's quite possible your customers in your market skew far more liberal or far more conservative.
Sure. Do you feel that customers' values shift over time, in response to events, or is it the same way they do in the voting booth, or?
Well, so values
Mm-hmm.
shift over time two interesting ways.
Yeah.
One is as people age, the cohort becomes more conservative.
Sure, sure.
Not all of them,
So as
but
they age, people become more conservative than if they were once
yes,
liberal at a younger age.
that's right. So
Interesting.
there's great research around the General Social Survey. I think it comes out of Northwestern
Mm-hmm.
that shows that young people 50 years ago were every bit as liberal as they are today. I mean, it's the differences are very small. So that doesn't mean that every young person becomes conservative when they get older,
Sure,
but
sure.
it is a clear trend over time.
Do you think that they
Now,
start off by being financially, so it's like they're socially democratic, but then they're financially conservative, and then it kind of just spawns into, because a lot of people find themselves. I mean, I have lots of friends that are very liberal from a political standpoint, but when it comes to finance, if they are above the bracket, they're very conservative from a financial standpoint. So maybe there's something that starts at that framework.
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
that can absolutely happen. And also to add to that, what we have also noticed are patterns where as people age, um, even when politics don't change, consumption does. Okay. So consumption patterns become more conservative.
Hmm.
And even though they might have very liberal voting patterns. Okay. So if you think about the split between liberal and conservative, typically the younger generation that's buying stuff today, Gen Z, 60-40 liberal, boomers, older Gen X, 60-40 conservative, right? So
Yeah.
it's not exclusive. But the other way that people change, and I found this one incredibly interesting, which is that, and there were several research studies that prove this. One is that when faced with fear, people become far more conservative. And when faced with safety, people become far more liberal.
Hmm.
Okay. And so a classic example of this would be right after 9/11, George W. Bush, Republican president, his approval rating goes to 90%,
Hmm.
which is just crazy,
Unheard
right?
of.
Yeah, unheard of. So then you think about, okay, what does this mean for business? Like, well, if you're selling insurance, home alarm systems, anything that could touch on safety or fear, it
Hmm.
becomes an interesting dimension. So if you've got like an insurance company with perhaps a more liberal facing brand, then you probably want to promote the safety you experience with insurance and vice versa if you have a more conservative brand.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. What was the most surprising insights that came out of your research? Give me like the
Well,
top two. I know there was probably plenty.
so there was the most surprising and kind of pleasantly surprising insight that came out of the research. And this is going to sound kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And 'cause what happens is you can't help but have this affect you personally, which is a
Yeah.
really interesting dimension
Yeah.
when you study this stuff and when people read the book or anything else on the topic.
Yeah. Just
But
because of like when you're going into the book, like where your mindset is in terms of your beliefs and stuff. Okay.
that's
Okay.
right. That's
Understood.
right. And I've had readers say, you know what, they were kind of a bit
Offended.
aggro. They were a bit
Yeah.
aggro about politics, and now they're not.
Oh,
So
amazing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because while it looks on the surface like, oh my gosh, is this just going to make us polarize more? And the answer is
Yeah.
no.
That's
Actually, the answer is the
fantastic.
opposite. So here's one of the
I
most
know a lot of
interesting.
people I could hand the book out to.
Well, yes, and I know a few too.
Yeah.
Uh, but one uber insight that emerged, which comes out of seeing, I think it was two or three things happen. Like I talked about the complementarity of the early adopter market and the more conservative later adopter market, right? And how the two markets work together to create scale. I also, was involved in research internally to see which job functions skew liberal or conservative, looking at billions of dollars worth of voting data. And that was interesting. It was like, so for example, 67% of people identifying as a marketer were liberal, and 68% of those identifying to work in sales are conservative. So if you ever wondered why the two groups don't always get along, then there you have it.
Oh, the marketing. Yes, that is an ongoing battle completely.
Yeah, but I won't get into the details. There are inherent strengths in those
Yes.
both worldviews for those roles. Okay,
Interesting.
so what you see within a business is also this same complementarity of people working together
Yeah.
with different worldviews, bringing different strengths to the table, and achieving a common objective.
Hmm.
And then the values themselves, the fact that the values are complementary, whether
Yes.
it's reliability versus innovation. So the big insight that came out was really, in spite of all the news, in spite of everything on TV, in spite of everything you read online, I came to the conclusion that the two worldviews were complementary, not in conflict. But it's
Yes.
very hard to see it, you know, with all the noise that we have in our lives. But if you look under the surface, it's quite clear. And that's it's one of my hopes in the work is to demonstrate this. And it's not something I set out to do. It's not something I looked
Yep.
for.
Yep.
It just kind of emerged.
Hmm. I love that. I want to shift a little bit to going into applying this framework and what you call the worldview brief.
Hmm.
But before we do that, talk to us a little bit about how LifeMind AI was born and your why in terms of that aha moment that this was really needed. Because I know that there is a lot of overlap from the book into LifeMind AI. So talk to us a little bit about why you started it and
Yeah.
what is the goal for this company.
Yeah. So the book came first, right? And I reconnected with my first business partner, and he got very excited about the content, and we started talking about the role that AI could play in understanding these types of insights. And one of the realizations along the way is that when you look at customer values, okay, what you're forced to do is look through the eyes of the customer at your business to see if it's a fit versus looking through your own eyes at the customer to try to sell them something. Okay. And we realized that values, in order to do this, the best way to do this would be to codify all the values, not just worldview, liberal and conservative, but also generational values and regional values. So we
Hmm.
developed
Hmm.
our own regional map of the United States, all based on cultural geography and specific value sets from original immigrants.
Hmm.
And what we found is that AI plays a incredible role in all this because as marketers, we cannot help but project our own values onto our market. It's just human nature, right? It's not like we're trying to convert anyone. It's just what, you just do it. I did it for decades.
Yeah.
And and so what AI is, it becomes this disinterested third party that can look at segments customer segments that are derived based on value sets. So we take non-PII customer data and feed it into our system. We segment it based on values. And then AI looks at that, looks at our database of values, and then derives the values that are most likely to help sell the product, and then develop the content and targeting in order to create that really tight fit from a values perspective, so that the product feels like it's just fits in their world. It's like, we want the customer to look around and go, yeah, this product just belongs with me. That's the kind of sense that we want to create. So the book was kind of the kernel of that, because the worldview is liberal and conservative. It's just a very powerful set of values.
Totally.
And then implementing AI to automate all of this really brought it to life. And I'll give you one quick example. I've been a writer for a long time. And when we implement AI using our system to create creative content for a segment, maybe it's a certain conservative audience in the Western US at a certain age, I read the copy content and I look at it and I say, I never would have written that, but I understand
Yeah.
why it was
Yeah.
written that way.
Yeah.
And so there's this incredible moment where you recognize that in order to sell into a pluralistic market made up of a
Interesting.
lot of different types of people, you need something to help you get out of your own mental model and shape something where you get yourself out of the equation.
Yes. Yes.
And that becomes very powerful.
That is really interesting, because I think as marketers, we're constantly focusing on how brands, services communicate, really, the what and their why. I mean, even down to like simple things, if it's just like a catchphrase, after a logo, or even if it's like a billboard and you're like, wait, how did they even like, come up with that and why?
Yeah.
Obviously, we hope that there's some kind of reason behind it. Sometimes it's just really bad marketing. But you have to kind of, I like that you bring up that point, because there is this juxtapose of, that gut reaction of like, I wouldn't have written it that way. But it's the further insight that we as marketers know, but are they really hitting the nail on the head and really communicating what they should be communicating to consumers is what I worry about.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And to me, it's that turning of the table.
Yep.
Like I'm old enough to have done focus groups, and I
Yep.
know they've kind of faded away. And we remember looking through the one-way mirror at the
Sure.
customers,
Yeah.
feeding them M&Ms and pizza,
Yeah.
and and
I've
this
done
is
those.
and this is putting the customers behind the one-way mirror and putting the
Yeah.
business out there with the peanuts and the M&Ms and the pizza, and it's the customers deciding, are you a fit for me?
Yes.
Versus the business saying, how do we force this fit onto a customer?
Yes. Yes. And the latter is not necessarily the right direction to be going in, especially with consumers becoming smarter and smarter today.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So this is a good segue into, to dive in a little bit into the worldview brief, and how
hmm
can companies use it to improve their marketing decisions. So maybe just unfold, what it is, and the how.
Yeah. So the very first question you want to ask, it's such a simple question that no business asks. Are my customers more liberal or conservative?
Yeah.
And no,
Do
but
you think
very
it's
few business.
almost like at the top? I don't mean to interrupt, but it's almost
Yeah.
like, the age old sort of like creative brief that everybody puts together when a new either product or service is coming out. If you've ever worked for a larger enterprise company and, you're getting ready, is that part of the brief question?
Yeah. So it's yes. So I
Okay.
see the worldview brief as an attachment
To the original.
to other briefs. Okay.
Got it.
And what the worldview brief does is it's additive insights to what you know today about your customers. So what you know today about your customers is all perfectly valid, but now there's this new dimension that helps you shape your communications as well as the targeting and the media choices and everything else. So the first question is, are my customers more liberal or conservative? And
Yeah.
there are often surprises, like people might have a hunch, but until you ask the question, now answering that can be really pretty straightforward. Are your customers a little bit more urban or ex-urban and rural? Or your database software that houses your customers might actually report on it because that same software company might be selling into political campaigns, and you might just be able to push a button. You can run a survey, a simple email survey, and just ask your customers,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and the way to do that, by the way, is it's something, it's usually included in part of a larger survey, but you say, I consider myself to be either liberal, a little bit liberal, conservative, or a little bit conservative. Nothing in the middle, though. You don't give them the option in the middle because they'll
Okay.
default to that.
Yeah,
Okay.
always, always.
Yeah. So that's the first step. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, look at this, and I've never seen a customer group be split 50-50 ever,
Interesting.
ever. I'm working with two companies right now. One is a extremely well-known globally mobile application. One is a fitness company in the US.
Okay, okay.
One has overwhelmingly number of liberal customers, the other conservative.
Mm-hmm,
Okay.
mm-hmm.
And that starts, so that becomes part of their worldview brief.
What's
And
the
then,
fitness one? I'm curious.
I'm sorry,
What's the fitness one? More skews more towards conservative or liberal?
conservative.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So let me give you an interesting result from a research study we ran.
Yeah.
So fitness is a huge category. Okay.
Yes.
And
Yes.
one reason is because, and YouGov has this data where liberal customers and conservative customers both like to exercise. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Huge market, huge market. Well, what type of exercise now starts to create the skew between the customers? So we ran a very simple study and we asked liberal and conservative customers, do you prefer strength over fitness or fitness over strength? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Very, it's kind of an odd thing to ask, but conservative customers preferred strength 2-to-1 over
Mm-hmm.
fitness, the concept of fitness. And
Okay.
liberal customers preferred fitness 2-to-1 over the concept of strength. And the
Interesting.
product that we're working with is a strength product. Okay.
Interesting. Yeah.
Now you would contrast that with, say, a Peloton, which is more fitness. It's a bike. It's aerobic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So even within a broad category like fitness, the product itself can skew toward one market or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully you can be dispassionate about it and say, well, I want to drive growth, so let's just understand them as opposed to being judgmental.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Before I go, sorry, go ahead.
no, go.
Before I dive in, because I kind of want to just dive in a little more into like making sure that we don't we how should I say this, that you know that we don't alienate one side over the other.
Yes.
But before we dive into that, another interesting kind of political shift, I think, just because of RFK's movement into this political house in the Republican time that we're in now, is that I believe that health and wellness was, and you can correct me if I'm wrong based on the data, had more of also a liberal take. And now it's kind of skewing more to the conservative take, when conservatives, I don't think, were as interested as they were in that kind of sector as they are in that sector now.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And I
Yeah.
think it depends on how you frame it. Like you said,
And I'm only
health
bringing
and
these up because it's in connection to like the shifts of like the political hemisphere, really.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that can absolutely happen, right?
Yeah.
Events can drive shifts
Yes.
and that can change your market.
Yes.
And it could be that, if you think of all the different ways you can characterize health, like if you say health and wellness, it might
Mm-hmm.
shift
Mm-hmm.
a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
But there may be other ways where you might someone else may frame it slightly differently, which would skew more conservative. But yeah, I mean, his influence on this is, it can it can make your head spin a bit,
Totally, totally.
you know?
So let's then dive into the alienation, ensuring
Yes.
that we don't alienate both sides, because I think the fitness industry is one that is very interesting to highlight them, because as consumers, there is a large group of people that are interested in fitness, but how does that break down and categorize? And you were starting to kind of categorize the different types of working out, and then the fitness versus strength, which I think is really cool. But when writing this brief, because it is kind of a new mindset for some marketers, and just the operating of like pulling out your ideal customer profile, how do we ensure that there's no alienation between the two?
Well, so here's here's another big insight that came out of the work,
Yeah.
which is, this is going to sound bad, but businesses think they're neutral today.
Yeah.
They're not.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And like, not to interrupt you again, I'll give you another example. I used to work at the New York Times, and
Mhm,
they are known to be very liberal, but they didn't take sides on certain things, right? I mean,
mhm.
they skewed away from saying, "Oh, we're totally this," but still, at the end of the day, maybe it was just because of the base of, who was buying the newspaper. They were more positioned in the market to be a liberal newspaper, right? Granted, when I came to them as a marketer saying, "Oh, we should go this way," and they're like, "No, no, we don't want to pick a certain famous person or this to like be our kind of spokesperson, because then it shifts towards that mindset of like, well, this spokesperson, has this political climate and so on and so forth." But with that said, it's interesting to note that when there is a liberal party in office, conservatives ended up buying the newspaper 1,000 times more than they would if there was a conservative in house. So
Oh, that's interesting.
it was a very interesting, and
Yeah.
I wanted to bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like the New York Times be one of the few
Hmm.
organizations that is intentional about it,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes.
And because most businesses aren't.
Yes.
And, here's another insight that comes out is, if you look at how a business was founded, okay, you can generally identify the worldview skew that it projects today. Okay. And the founding, I found, could have happened 50, 60, 70 years ago, or it could have happened last week. But the founding people tend to put a stamp on the culture early on
Hmm.
that just keeps going. So it comes back to this idea of like, okay, businesses today are rarely neutral. And I say rarely because I'm sure there's some out there, but I haven't seen any, you
Yeah.
know, and they tend to skew one way or the other. And the question then becomes, okay, how are they affecting their market today? So to your question about alienation, how do you
Yeah.
do this in a low risk way? Well, businesses are already doing that. And so
Yeah.
the idea is to make this intentional and to do it in a way where you minimize that. Because what happens that really struck me was that when you project a certain set of values onto the market, whether it's liberal or conservative, and the other group sees it, and
Hmm.
let's assume the values you're projecting has nothing to do with politicians or politics or policy, it's just good old values. Then what happens is the group that doesn't align, your product just fades away. It just
Yeah.
kind of goes to the background. And that is the risk that exists today. And it's the risk that exists if you don't put this on the table.
Yeah.
Whereas if you make this intentional and you say, oh, wow, look, our customers actually skew this and our markets actually skew this way. Let's design this so that we can maximize fit and growth. And in the process of doing that, you actually minimize all the risk that we talked about. The only reason like Target gets into trouble in the press, is because liberal founded organization, the family in, Minneapolis, um, very progressive brand, and they happen to have a substantial piece of their footprint in conservative areas by
Hmm.
nature of being a big box store that cannot
Sure.
always be in an urban environment.
Sure.
Okay. So, that's pretty unique. You have to be a pretty big retailer to have that issue, but they could
Yeah.
also look at their situation differently and even try to segment it a little.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I love that you bring up that target, because you wouldn't think so. Here is a question that I have, in regards to what is, when writing this worldview brief and really kind of focusing down on, adding another kind of layer to your ICP, so your customer profile or ideal customer profile. What is kept internal versus external? Because I'm sure questions have come up in terms of, does acknowledging these differences like risk deepening our political division? So, obviously Target's not shouting out that like, we're a liberal company, and other products and services aren't shouting out that they're more of a conservative. It kind of seeps into the market, if you will, and I want to get into how it seeps in, but what is more of like an internal like movement versus what really is presented from the outside?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think if you stick to the values without any what I would call associated badges,
Mm-hmm.
then you're fine.
Yeah.
But I'll get to a situation where, the badges get people into trouble.
Yeah.
But like if I just rattle off these values, I mean, tell me if any of these sound controversial,
Yeah. Yeah.
self-image, thought styles, influences, visual styles, empathy, trust, good and evil, fear and safety, horror, winning, success, status. These are all areas where the two groups think a little differently.
Yeah.
None of those are controversial,
No.
right? But to your point, when a company grabs something like DEI is a classic example, right?
Yes. Yes.
When DEI becomes a badge for the market,
Yes.
well, then it depends on who your market is.
Yes.
Okay. That doesn't mean you shouldn't believe in it if it somehow gets you into trouble. Like Tractor Supply, a very large, successful kind of hardware big box store that's in mostly conservative areas, had to really dial back on how much they were promoting DEI. But
Oh,
I could
yeah.
tell, but I could tell that internally they were still going to believe in it because you cannot run an organization that big without it,
No.
right?
No.
So that it really just boils down to, are you going to create a badge around a set of values that you're going to push into the market? And I think every company will come to a different conclusion on that. Some will say
Yeah.
our values are our values, we don't
Yeah.
care, and that's fine. Then just optimize to that market, right? So, there's no good or bad answer to that.
Yeah. So then, in terms of it seeping into the market of, consumers knowing, like, for example, I never knew Target was more on the liberal side, right? But
Hmm.
how much of that is controlled by the brand versus consumer chatter? Because I think that's also interesting. And I think it does go back to, as long as you stick with the values, then you're good, right? Because I think it goes back to that brief, right? It's values,
Yes.
values, values, which is what drives the content and the conversation and market. And yes, there's only so much that we can control from consumer chatter, but what have you seen in terms of how it really seeps into the market? Because it's predominantly consumer chatter, I would believe.
Yeah, 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 you're absolutely right. And I think you can only control what you can control.
Yes.
And I think the only time you're going to get negative chatter is when your values are in conflict with a portion of the market. And an interesting insight about that is that, and this is a little hard to describe, but backlash will almost always come from
Yeah.
conservative customers. And
Yeah.
there's an interesting reason behind it. There's multiple research sources that say that when liberal customers see something liberal, their trust accelerates, but when they see something conservative, they're neutral.
Yeah.
Conservative customers, on the other hand, when they see something conservative, they're neutral. When they see something liberal, their trust decelerates.
Yeah.
Okay. Which
Interesting.
is why backlash almost exclusively comes from conservative customers.
Yeah.
And I think you control what you can control. I think you can shape, I gave you the list of like some
Keywords.
common values
Yeah.
that are detailed in the book. You can lean into those things, but I think it comes back to the worldview brief. Really understanding who your customers are from this perspective, easy to do,
Yeah.
understanding your market, and then having an open, dispassionate, non-judgmental discussion about what should our strategy be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you may not change, how you project your values, but you can actually drive growth even if you do that.
Yeah.
Because there are all these other things you can do that you weren't even aware of.
Yeah. No, totally. Are there certain industries where this is particularly more relevant, and ones where it matters less?
Well, I think, we touched on launching an innovative product, and I think
Hmm.
it's front and center there.
Yeah.
I think from an industry perspective,
An innovation from a tech standpoint, or it's innovation from any standpoint?
well, it tends to come from tech because
Okay.
tech tends to have the disruptive, habit changing,
Sure.
think different like Apple, right?
Yeah.
Perspective. Because the flip side of innovation, and innovation isn't really the perfect word because ingenuity
Hmm.
is a common value. And like if you were trying to frame an innovative product for a conservative audience, you could lean into ingenuity more than
Yeah.
something disruptive.
Yeah,
Okay.
because I have a question then from because biotech can be disruptive, but can also be ingenuity as well. Well, I mean, any kind of tech, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay. I get it
I
now.
mean, I mean, when you think of the vaccine development
Mm-hmm.
for
Mm-hmm.
COVID,
Yep.
ingenuity is
Yes.
you could say it's disruptive, but
Mm-hmm.
honestly, good old, it's that old phrase, good old American ingenuity. That's
Yes.
everyone can relate to that,
Yeah.
right? So, I think if you just stick with the values and not put badges on it, then
Yeah.
everything's fine.
Yeah. In your research, just kind of digging into this further, were there brands that kind of popped up that were surprising that leaned more conservative or liberal? Or were
Well,
you like, it was just an aha moment? You're like, okay, now I get it.
yeah, I think, well, it's funny. One of my readers said something interesting. He said, I can't look at advertising the same way again. If you go through the values and you go through the background
I'm
of it,
sure.
honestly, you will see marketing totally differently.
Different. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there are two brands that I profile in the book. One is apartments.com and one is WeatherTech. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Now, apartments.com, and these are both very successful companies
Mm-hmm.
that going after different markets, okay?
Yeah.
And one point I make in the book is that both markets are fantastic. They're both.
And are these companies doing it well?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, they are. But
Okay.
not, I don't know how intentional they are, but it
Okay.
shows how the alignment can really give you a tailwind.
Yeah.
So for example, apartments.com, apartment buildings tend to be in higher density population areas, which are
Yeah.
going to be more liberal. Founded by more liberal founders. They have Jeff Goldblum as a celebrity spokesperson who's
Mm-hmm.
active politically. The ads are about the apartment internet in the future. It's very
Yeah.
futuristic and different. All of that lines up beautifully. And then you have
Mm-hmm.
WeatherTech, founded by a conservative founder, selling rubber mats for cars.
Yeah.
And now car ownership skews slightly conservative, but not
Mm-hmm.
much.
Mm-hmm.
And he injects conservative themes in his advertising. He's very hands-on, the founder, very hands-on with the advertising, with the agencies. And they're like they ran Super Bowl ads for years. I don't know if they
Yeah.
still do, but like these militaristic helicopters would drop these people out down into a suburban house and they would install these mats and make everything wonderful.
Yeah.
And to your question, is like I didn't look at it that way
Yes.
before, but now you can just see these things
Yeah.
and very successful. And I was even talking to my liberal accountant
Yeah.
about the WeatherTech ads after they ran on the Super Bowl, and I described it to him just like I described it to you. And he said to me something interesting. He said, I remember that ad, and I remember thinking, that's not for me.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, and you own a car, don't you? And he goes, yeah, I have a Subaru. And I said, of course you do.
Yeah.
You know, I I mean,
I love it.
if you look at car ads through this lens,
Oh yeah.
you'll be like hitting your forehead all the time going,
Oh,
"Oh
I
my
can
God."
I'm like having like like when I mean something bad happens and you say, "Oh, my life flashed in front of me." Like I'm having all of the Super Bowl car commercials flash in front of me now and I'm like, "Oh my God, conservative, liberal, conservative, liberal."
Yes.
Just going through
Dodge
my head.
Ram,
Oh yeah,
Dodge Ram.
Volvo. Volvo's a big
Yes.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that even though one might appeal to the group that you're
Yeah.
not a part of,
Yeah.
it doesn't make you mad,
Yeah.
right? I
No, it
mean, it
doesn't.
doesn't, no,
It's indifferent almost.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
But we are seeing we have seen aggravation towards Tesla,
Yes.
in most recent times, which is interesting, but I just think it's the heat of the moment.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I tell some people, I said, I don't know how much I can learn about Elon Musk
Yeah.
and Tesla because he's such a one-off,
Yeah.
right?
You're
I mean,
right.
how many of CEOs do we know are going to end up in the White House doing what
Yes.
he does, right?
Not many. Not
Not
many.
many. No.
No, no, no. So just just to go back to the internal and external, I want to talk a
Yes.
little bit more about the internal facing because I think it's particularly interesting as it relates to like leadership's application towards these principles.
Yes.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the I think this opens up an incredibly interesting discussion
Hmm.
among leadership.
Hmm.
Okay. And I've seen bits and pieces of it happen with a CEO who may be more conservative and a marketing team that might be more liberal. Okay.
Yes, yes.
And the way to do it sounds kind of dicey, right? Like, do you really want to bring this up at work? But the
Yeah.
fact is, if you have the tools to, excuse me, if you have the tools to approach it in a dispassionate manner that's evidence based, where you show some analysis of your own customers
Hmm.
and your
Hmm.
market,
Hmm.
it becomes an incredibly productive exercise. It has massive implications for media choices, targeting, the creative briefs, how you talk to your agency partners if you work with an agency partner. And it ends up being a super interesting conversation. Now, I get that some businesses are not going to want to do it. Okay,
Yeah,
I get
yeah,
it. But those that want a new lever for growth, I think this is a perfect opportunity because
yeah,
engaging in this topic won't cost you anything.
yeah. I have a question. Folks that step out into entrepreneurship, more
Hmm.
conservative or more liberal?
Uh, you know, Surprisingly,
Yeah.
they are more conservative,
Okay.
even though, so you think of startup founders who are always in the news or,
Yeah.
more liberal.
Yeah.
But it's funny when you see startups scale and be
Yeah.
super successful,
Yeah.
what happens? You have the early liberal
Mm-hmm.
founder who then goes off and
Drops
hires a
off.
more
Yeah.
conservative
Yeah.
CEO
Yeah. Exactly. Or they
to
kind of like
stabilize.
get bought out, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Very
yeah,
interesting. Very
yeah,
interesting. Chris, this
yeah.
has been such an insightful conversation. So many new ideas. I can't personally wait to get into the book. But before I let you go, I like to do something fun, which is kind of like a fireside wrap up. And I just throw some questions at you, whatever comes to mind. Just feel free to say it.
All right.
So, what's one marketing truth you've come to question or rethink over your career?
Well, related to this, it's really how much am I projecting myself onto my decisions?
Yes. Oh, so
Um,
from a personal standpoint.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's been a big turnaround for me.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
I know it's kind of separating yourself, I think, is very key and important here.
yeah, stepping outside of yourself is
Yes,
key.
stepping outside of yourself. I like it. I like that. If a small business owner is listening, what's the one first step they can take to better understanding their customer worldview? The customer worldview brief?
Yeah, so that I think a first step would be for the entrepreneur to ask themselves, what is my worldview?
Yeah.
And how much of that is being projected in my business? Am I hiring people just like me from that
Yeah.
perspective? And do my customers reflect that? And I think because that's yeah, honestly, it's those what I came to realize is those early days are when so much is shaped
Yeah.
that is very hard to change later.
Yeah. Very true. So we talked about weathertechapartments.com. What's another brand today that you think walks the tightrope well when it comes to navigating political worldview?
Well, the one that I find impressive, honestly, is Walmart
Okay.
because they have a conservative footprint
Mm-hmm.
and they are massive, they are
Mm-hmm.
successful,
Mm-hmm.
and they just don't seem to rub anyone the wrong way
None.
somehow.
You're so right. You're
Yeah,
so right. It's the store for anyone and everyone.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 And I did see them. I think they were testing some new advertising where
Yeah.
they were trying to look very hip, cool, and urban. And I thought, well, that's going to go away pretty fast. Okay,
Mm.
that's just not what Walmart is.
Do
Okay.
you think Home Depot falls into that category too?
Um, yeah, I think they do. So conservative
Mm-hmm.
CEO for
Mm-hmm.
decades.
Mm-hmm.
Conservative, and see, I've got the data in front of you. Yeah, so 62% conservative retail footprint.
Super interesting.
And they Yeah, I think so. I think they do pretty well on that front. They
Yeah.
rank very high in brand trust with
Yes.
conservatives, not even on the list for liberal customers.
Yes.
But you don't feel odd walking in there, no matter
Mm-mm.
what side you're on.
No, I completely agree. I know so
Yeah.
many people that are Home Depot fans and Walmart fans.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's one book, podcast, or thinker aside from yourself that marketers should turn to right now?
Oh God. So I this is going to sound like a really obscure recommendation. But one of the central heroes of my work early on, it's not even mentioned in the book, is a woman named Mary Douglas, who was a
Okay.
cultural anthropologist from England in the 70s. And she developed a culture model. It's called culture theory. It's very well known in cultural anthropology. And she wrote a book called Thought Styles, which is a bit academic. So this is kind of an obscure recommendation, but it really opened up my eyes in terms of seeing the world through multiple lenses as different cultures in a super non-judgmental way.
Yeah. Very cool. We'll definitely have to check that out. So you're living in Milan now. How
Yes.
has Italy shifted your view on American marketing?
Well, I got to tell you, this is a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
So if you think about, the liberal conservative divide as being pretty much 50-50, it's true throughout Europe. I mean, you've got these coalitions who
Yeah.
make it a little fuzzier, but then even geographically, you realize every country is made of distinct regions. And unfortunately, in the United States, the regions are not demarcated by states. Like if you create a cultural map of the United States, and many people have done this, including us at LifeMind, the lines run all the way through and across states in terms of different types of population. And in being in Europe, you see these distinct regions that make up Italy or France or
Yeah.
any of these other countries, and you realize, yeah, the world is just made up of these very distinct groups of people that aren't even defined by country. And I think that becomes super interesting to study. But of course, I'm a research fan, so
Yeah.
that would
Yeah.
interest me.
Good marketers love research. So,
Yes, yes.
well, this has been such a pleasure, Chris. I truly appreciate it. Please let us know where everybody can find you. I'll also be linking everything down below so that they can click on it. But how can we get your book? Because I know I'm buying one right when we get off this call. And I will definitely be checking out lifemind.ai.
Great. Yes. So the book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and soon Apple Books. And if anyone wants to reach out, you can just contact me at, on the lifemind.ai website. And also, honestly, we're in the middle of coding a platform that enables a lot of this. But if somebody wants to determine if their customers skew more liberal or conservative because they can't get the answer themselves, we'd be happy to run that analysis
Yeah.
for your listeners. And there's no registration or gimmick or anything. We're not
Yeah.
trying to sell anything right now. So it's interesting for us to run that kind of analysis.
Yeah, no, I'd really like that. That would be really interesting, and we'll make sure to link all of that below. So again, thank you so much, Chris. You have a beautiful rest of the day in Italy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.